Welcome to Stoic Conversations. My name is Caleb Ontiveros,
I'm Michael Tremblay.
and today we're going to be kicking off a series on Cicero's On Ends. That's De Finibus Bonorum et Malorum. So this is a Roman work of philosophy by the orator, statesman, and of course philosopher Cicero. And we'll be doing a series going through it, all four books of On Ends, and discussing what we think are some of the most interesting, essential, and important parts of the work.
Yeah.
Yeah, it should be a lot of
Then
fun.
once we've done the whole thing, you can marathon it like Lord of the Rings or something.
Yeah, that's
It'll
right.
be a perfect set. I'm super looking forward to it. I love this book. I loved it when I read it before, and I started rereading it again. And even the translation I'm reading is from like the early 1900s, and it's such a great read. And this is either a really great translation from that time, or Cicero's he's got the chops.
Yeah. Well, Cicero, we haven't talked about Cicero as much, in part because he is not a Stoic, though he's very sympathetic to the Stoics, but he is one of the main sources for Stoicism in the ancient world because he gives a sympathetic portrayal, as well as, and we'll talk about this today, Epicureanism. And for that reason, I think, if of course, if you're interested in Stoicism at all, it's worth going directly to the Stoics themselves, Seneca, Epicurus, Marcus Aurelius. But if you really want to dive into Greco-Roman philosophy generally, Cicero is an essential source, not just
Yeah.
philosophically, but I think historically as well. So just before we jump into the substance of the first book, just some words by way of intro. So Cicero, he wrote this in 45 BC, and Julius Caesar crossed the Rubicon in 49 BC. And this was part of the Roman Civil War. Of course, this is during the time of the fall of the Republic. So it's a time of turmoil for Rome. Cicero tries to stay out of the Civil War, but eventually endorses the losing side. He endorses Pompey the Great, who Cato the Younger, who we've talked about, the great Stoic, also endorsed. Cato the Younger actually died the previous year in 46. He took his own life rather than being pardoned by Caesar. Cicero accepted the pardon. But at this point, he's effectively out of the action. And for Cicero, that's an important fact. So I think it's probably something that was difficult for him to deal with psychologically, the fact that he was out of the center of Roman political action, because that's what so much of his life had been oriented around. But another level of his life, of course, I think was philosophy, rhetoric, and that's what he took solace in, and I think returned to some of these fundamental philosophical questions, which is what On Ends is all about, before getting back into the fray, which he does. And I think it's just important to emphasize, I think, that this is a time of turmoil, great contingency for these elite Romans. As I said, Cato the Younger had taken his life during the Civil War previous year. Julius Caesar is on the top of the world right now, 45 BC. He doesn't know it, but he only has like one more year to live. Cicero is going to be called back into action, but he only has 2 more years to live. So amongst this, like all this action, you can imagine it really ought to be captured better in some of our movies, perhaps. But you can almost imagine him taking a little bit of a respite and then thinking through some of these deep philosophical questions, perhaps to reorient himself. Perhaps, and in itself, it's a kind of therapy. So anyway, that's just some words by way of background. You have anything else you want to add to that, Michael?
Yeah, I mean, my Roman history isn't great. I have a philosophy degree, not a classics degree, so I sometimes get really caught up in these, beautiful ideas, and I lose sense of that context. It's really interesting context. You've got this, many great Romans dying. Seems like on both sides. Um, Cicero is going to die 2 years after he wrote this, and I don't know. It's kind of it's an interesting context. Um, and I think goes to show that Cicero's still taking these questions seriously, or taking this kind of work seriously, even though he's in the middle of really politically tumultuous time.
What you just said help frame for me is that one way, I think one way this, I didn't express well enough, the fact that this is such a intense time for Romans, and yet Cicero takes the time to think through these philosophical issues, I think speaks to how seriously he takes them, and
Mm-hmm.
perhaps how seriously we should take them as well.
He's not somebody trying to show off or trying to cement his position or anything like this. It's like if you looked at Maslow's hierarchy of needs, I know there's issues with that framing, but what are these rich, powerful, important Romans do, or at least Cicero? He says, well, this is the most important thing for me to do now, is reflect deeply on what's the point of life, right? On ends, what's the meaning of it? Why do we? What's the better way to live? Yeah, great.
Yeah, absolutely. And then you said you wanted to dive into some of the writing.
Well, not the quote itself, but just some context on the writing for
Okay,
those that are
cool.
listening.
Yeah.
So, in our timeline, right, Cicero is 45 BC, so that puts him actually like almost 200 to 250 years before Marcus Aurelius. So we sometimes lose track of that time. Puts him about 250 years after Chrysippus, um, and after Zeno and Cleanthes and these the first founders of the school of Stoicism. So he's kind of in this middle period, and he's pre-Roman Stoics is the point I wanted to make. When we think about Stoicism, we often think about Seneca, Marcus Aurelius, and Epictetus. Maybe if you're a bit hardcore, you add Musonius Rufus in there. But he's writing before this. So Marcus Aurelius, when he writes, is influenced by Epictetus. Maybe Seneca, when he writes, is influenced by Cicero. But Cicero is influenced by the Greek Stoics, the early Stoics. And I think that's really cool, because he's writing based on Stoics that we've lost, right? Like his understanding of Stoicism comes from texts we don't have anymore. He's reading these original sources and talking about these original sources. There's also this framing in philosophy sometimes where it's like, well, the Roman Stoics are popular because they really care about practical issues. They care about how to live. They care about the ethics. Um, and then the earlier Stoics were a bit more boring, or, maybe not boring, but like metaphysical or logic or things like this. And you get this almost opposite picture of Cicero, who is reading the earlier Stoics and having these really clear, concrete thoughts about how to live in the good life. And maybe we prioritize the Roman Stoics because they're who we have left, not, maybe they're not more interesting or exciting or more exciting than the earlier Stoics writing was. And then the third thing that I wanted to hit on was that Cicero's doing, we'll get into it, he's doing the same thing we're doing, Caleb, which is he's reading what smart people said before him and doing his best to make sense of it and summarize it accurately and compellingly and wrestle with it and digest it and internalize it. He's doing the thing we're doing. And it's cool to see somebody 2,000 years ago doing what we're doing, which is like reading the Stoics and wrestling with them and agreeing with some of what they say and struggling with other things they say and being pulled towards um, Epicureanism in some directions, and then Stoicism or skepticism in others. It's very cool to see him do the same project. Um, yeah, and then one other thing I wanted to add, because my ideas are just coming in pairs now. One thing I was thinking, and I thought this was smart, so you tell me if this is not as smart as I think it is, but one of the criticisms of philosophy is that it's not really made any progress. Like, right? Like some people look at the fact that we're still talking about the Stoics and they see that as not a good thing. They think philosophy it's not something where concrete progress can be made. It's kind of self-indulgent. Maybe it's artistic. And I was thinking about that with Cicero because Cicero's here doing what we're doing. We haven't made any progress in Cicero, not really. We're still just reflecting on the Stoics. And then I thought, well, that's an issue if you think of philosophy, I don't know, almost like a science, but it's not an issue if you think of philosophy as a craft, right? Like painters are still trying to learn how to paint. Wrestlers are still learning how to wrestle. Runners are still learning how to run. It's not weird that if I'm a runner, that I'm doing the same thing a Roman did, trying to learn how to run. It's only when you try to look at it like it needs to be this concrete science that gets built upon that it seems like an issue. But if you view it as like an individual craft of self-transformation, then yeah, he's doing that. He's practicing his self-transformation, and so are we. That's another thought that I had.
Yeah, well, I suppose the thought is that philosophy is in the activity. It's in
Yeah, exactly.
to philosophize is it involves these practices that we focus a lot on, but also, of course, these discourses, conversations, essentially working on thinking better philosophically, and that is, I think the craft analogy is perfect here. It's not something you're going to be able to say immediately take whatever knowledge has come from the past and apply it immediately. Instead, you need to work through it to some extent, do the proofs yourself, do the thinking yourself
Yeah,
so that you
exactly.
can, uh, so then you can be a better philosopher.
Yeah. And so that's my brain
Nice.
dump on why I think on ends is cool.
Yeah. So book one, I sort of has three sections to it. First, there's by way of introduction, Cicero dispatches with some objections to his project, and then he introduces the work, which is sort of captured as a dialogue. Um, like many dialogues, perhaps consist largely of long speeches, but it's a dialogue between himself and two Epicureans, Lucius Torquatus and Gaius Triarius. Um, and that first bit is essentially Cicero's diatribe against Epicureanism, the philosophy of Epicureanism, and the final section is Torquatus's, apologies about the pronunciation, defense of Epicureanism against Cicero's assault. So we'll go through all of those sections quickly, but the first section I think is interesting. It doesn't really get to the main substance of the discussion, these debates over the philosophy of life. But I thought it was nice to see Cicero dispatch with objections like philosophy is basically just for dilettantes. It's not important, or that philosophy should be done only in ancient Greek, not in Latin. And finally, that don't you, Cicero, have better uses of your time than uh, writing philosophy? And to which Cicero responds to that last one. Basically, I've used my time real well writing tons of other great works, so now I have time to take on this additional great work, which to some extent is true. And I like how he worked through the objection that philosophy should be done in ancient Greek, which just for some context here, Greek was sort of the language of the educated people in Rome. Marcus Aurelius wrote his meditations in Greek. Arrian took his notes of Epictetus's discourses in Greek because Greek was sort of like the high status language, is what most educated folk would do. They probably perhaps like we do today, look on more favorably on ancient Greek philosophy, ancient Greek works of arts like Euripides and so on. But Cicero says, I'm going to write this in Latin. That's Latin's a fine language, has many fine works, and every educated person should not be, no educated person should be ashamed of Latin.
It's kind of funny. I think it's like, when I pull out my Latin knowledge, which is not a lot, but my Latin knowledge and day-to-day language, man, you seem so pretentious. And I'm not trying to be pretentious. I just genuinely think Latin is cool. And so it's funny to me to see somebody who is, very fluent in Latin kind of having to defend himself about like not being hardcore enough or not doing it in the original You just see those kind of the same kind of cycles that we get in academia today, or kind of gatekeeping. So fun to see Cicero wrestle with that as well.
Yeah, yeah. Do you have anything else to say about it in terms of that intro, or do you want to jump into Epicureanism?
Um, I mean, we'll jump into it, but you mentioned it. It's a dialogue, but it's mostly like Cicero goes on a monologue about why Epicurean. Oh, gee, I cannot say that today for some reason. Epicureanism, is that it? Epicure.
Yeah,
I
you
can say
nailed it.
Epicurus.
You
There
could
it
say,
is.
yeah, why
Um,
Epicurus is wrong.
yeah, why Epicurus is wrong. So Cicero goes in that uh, long monologue of why Epicurus is wrong, and then there's this long monologue back. So it's I like the dialogue format. I think it's fun, but I always think it's funny when it takes the form of just long monologues.
Yeah,
But no, let's jump into it. Let's see what he has to say.
cool. Yeah, so Cicero he mounts an assault, I should say, on Epicureanism, on Epicurus. He sort of two pronged, if you will. He takes on the metaphysics, the natural sciences, which he says is derivative of Democritus. Democritus, the founder of atomism, which Epicurus largely took over. But Epicurus did make some changes, and Cicero says where he made changes, he just made the philosophy worse. So much the worse for Epicureans on that front, but also centrally, and this is going to be the main point of the discussion, I think, the ethics itself is mistaken. So Epicurus, he believed that the best life was the pleasurable one, and that pleasure. We've talked about this before. We have several episodes, interviews with Emily Wilson, and these pleasure isn't like the Cyrenaics who we also just discussed, isn't sort of this intense state, but it's a state of tranquility, freedom from pain that's best found by exercising virtue as an Epicurean. So that's the view, and Cicero put some objections to that kind of view in his monologue. So I don't know if you want to dive into the metaphysics a little bit, or just go straight to the ethics.
I think the ethics is more fun.
Cool, cool. Yeah. So what are your impressions of his objections to the ethics?
I mean, that's one of the things that makes it really good. I remember there's this story of the skeptic. I can't remember their exact name. Maybe you remember, Caleb, who was presenting in, oh, I think it was Rome,
Is it
and
Carneades?
they gave the speech one day, and everybody's like, wow, that person's such a great, such a great orator. I really agree with everything they say. And you come back the next day, and he was arguing against his original position, and they were just as convinced, and they were like, what? That's the way I feel reading this, because he starts with a criticism, and when he was giving the criticism, I was nodding along, and I was like, yeah, great. And then there's the rebuttal, and I'm like, ooh, now I don't know how I feel about Cicero's original criticisms, because the rebuttal was pretty good. Um, let me try to think on some of the main criticisms that stood out. There was one about, there's one about trying to double dip by trying to say, virtue isn't a good thing, it's pleasure, but you need virtue to feel pleasure. And it's like, well, that's just pretty convenient, isn't it? Um, that Cicero says about the argument. And he's like, that's just like it's almost like you're getting to the truth of the matter, which is that pleasure or virtue is the good life, but you're like you're masquerading that around this claim about pleasure. Um, I think that's a really good point. He also makes some other arguments about how, look at all of the great people and how many of them have kind of painful lives. It really is this. When I think about happiness in the Stoic sense, when you think about flourishing, I like to think about that idea of like who lived a great life. And that's really what the Greeks meant, because Aristotle talks about, well, you can't say if someone's happy until they die. Makes no sense if we're using it in the English sense of the term. But if we think about, you can't say who had a great life until looking upon their life after they've passed away. That's a coherent thing to say.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's really what the Stoics and the Greeks were trying to get at. And Cicero's point is his other anti-pleasure point is that I mean, look at the people we think had great lives or were great people or who we admire, who we look up to, we put on a pedestal. A lot of them really suffered. And not only did they suffer, but they suffered to be great. Um, if I think of people that were martyrs or sacrificed, or if you use the Stoic example, you stand up to the tyrant, you get thrown in jail. That person is great because of their willingness to endure discomfort, not because they netted more pleasure. The person who gets thrown in jail by the tyrant is not making like a strategic decision about long-term pleasure. No, they're great because they did the right thing in spite of the pain it would bring them. I think that's his most compelling point, and I tend to agree.
Yeah, absolutely. I think so. I think that's the central objection he has to Epicurus is, well, the Epicureans, they have this sort of two aspects to, they hold both sort of a descriptive and a normative thesis concerning pleasure, which is to say they think that humans pursue pleasure just naturally. That's what we do. That's our final end. So that's that descriptive part, just a description of human nature. And then crucially, this has the ethical upshot that the best life is the pleasurable one. And Cicero's or challenging both of those by listing examples of people. He has one example from an ancestor of Lucius Torquatus, another famous Torquatus who was a successful, glorious Roman general. And he says, look, did he fight these battles in hope of experiencing pleasure? And then famously, this general made a command to instill discipline in Roman troops that no one leave their post. And his son saw that there were enemies within his reach, left his post, killed those enemies, returned, and then celebrated his success. But in sort of classic Roman discipline, this ancestor of Torquatus, held the line and had his own son executed because he left his post. And Cicero says, look, this person we hold up as a great Roman, did he really do that in order to feel pleasure, or did he do it because he values something else, martial discipline, what have you, or whatever cause was driving him to defend Rome.
Yeah.
Yeah, which is, as when you put it that way, then you think, yeah, that's surely there are more things we want in life than pleasure, and that's a strong example.
Well, it almost makes me think of that the Epicureans are getting confused because the Stoics have this intellectualist claim, right? Which is that people only ever do what they think is best. And I agree with that claim. And that's a descriptive claim. And then the normative claim in the Stoic sense is that, well, some of these people get that wrong and you should just actually do what is best. But it's almost like the Epicureans are like confusing the fact that people do what they think is best in each situation with the idea that people will do and should do what brings the most pleasure, because I can do what's best even with the recognition that it was going to cause me more suffering, because I just need a criteria of good that doesn't just place all the value on pleasure and pain.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And as soon as I do that, then that I can, because that's the way they try to get out of it. In my view is they say, well, maybe he thought that if he let his son live, he would be so ashamed of his son that it would be like more painful from his own shame and his sense of himself being a hypocrite. That would be more painful than actually executing his son. That would have to be the Epicurean argument. And that just seems, no, he did what he thought was best, but he just wasn't, his value system of good and bad has variables that aren't just pleasure and pain.
Yeah, absolutely. He also makes a sort of subtle point that I think you're hitting on here, that I'll just read. Epicurus declares right conduct and moral worth to be intrinsically and of themselves delightful, which means productive of pleasure. And he says, this is why so many people believe. This is why so many men are Epicureans, because they find that plausible. And he continues, these worthy people do not realize that if this is true, it would upset the theory altogether. If it were admitted that goodness is spontaneously and intrinsically pleasant, even without any reference to bodily feeling, then virtue would be desirable for its own sake, and so also would knowledge. But this Epicurus by no means allows. So I think that there's that point that, look, many people, they find Epicureanism plausible, perhaps because there's this match between right conduct and pleasure and delight. But that requires a one-to-one mapping that, once you, I think, draw out what virtue means, doesn't exist, because we don't think something's virtuous just because of some bodily feeling, or some associated pleasure and such. I think it can't just be that goodness is intrinsically pleasant because there's some reference to bodily feeling. He's saying there's something more to what we find valuable in goodness. And I think that just goes back to some of your examples of great people who experience pain. Yeah, there's a sense in which they think the best action has a kind of satisfaction with it, but it's not, that satisfaction isn't identical to what we would typically think of as pleasure. It's the best action, and that's why it's that's why we're choosing it, or that's why they choose it.
Yeah, to put it in other words, there's kind of a circularity or something, if I'm understanding your point right, and Cicero's point. Anyway, it's not, it doesn't feel, it's not the good thing to do because it feels good. We take a degree in satisfaction because we recognize that we're achieving something else that is intrinsically desirable, that isn't pleasure. And because we think we're achieving that, we feel good. But that's the thing that we're reaching for, that recognition that, hey, I did the right thing. Hey, I'm living in accordance with nature in a Stoic view or whatever. That's the thing that we're reaching for. And yeah, that feels good, but it's not good because it feels good. Is this right?
Yeah, I think so. I think that's probably slightly different than what I was trying to get at, but it's another it's in the same neighborhood, and I think also a good argument. So
are they neighbors, or
yeah,
are they across the the way?
Yeah, they're close. But so I think those are some of Cicero's arguments against Epicureanism. Then we immediately turn to the defense of Epicurus, and then book 2 is Cicero's response to the defense. But Torquatus, he says, look, leaving aside the metaphysics, let's talk about the ethics. That's where most of the action is. And something I like here is one of his starting arguments is that we don't need that much reasoning or debate to show why pleasure is a matter for desire, pain for aversion. We simply perceive it. It's just observed in the same way we observe that fire is hot, snow is white, honey is sweet. We don't need elaborate arguments. We just see that people pursue pleasure naturally. And just starting from this simple observation, we can build a philosophy on top of it, which I think is a good one, because sometimes people build up systems and they end up being fragile. They end up being divorced from ordinary reality. Sometimes people object to intuitions, as intuitions can be distorted and such, but ultimately that's where knowledge begins, is with some basic observations. And it's hard to deny that pleasure is, at least in some way, worth pursuing. There's something valuable about pleasure, something disvaluable about pain. So I think that's a fine starting point for a philosophy.
Yeah, well, to frame it differently, it would be to move away from pleasure and pain without a good argument is almost unnatural, right? It's like you're overcomplicating things. If we looked at people in a if an alien came down to Earth and said, well, what matters to humans? Well, pleasure and pain is what matters to humans. And then you'd need some sort of argument to move away from it. And I guess the Epicurean feels like there isn't a very compelling one.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where he comes in next and says, those who, in my translation at least, it says, those who place the chief good in virtue alone are beguiled by the glamour of a name and do not understand the true demands of nature. And he just means like, you really do just actually just care about pleasure, and you place this value in virtue because you get you get impressed by it, or it's like a cultural artifice that gets put on you. I really like this example too, where he says, um, we esteem the art of medicine not for its interest as a science, but for its conduciveness to health. The art of navigation is commended for its practical and not scientific value, but because it conveys the rules for sailing a ship with success. So also wisdom, which must be considered as the art of living, if it affected no result, would not be desired. But as it is desired because it procures and produces pleasure. And so I guess there's this argument here that we start desiring pleasure, then we grow up and we see, okay, well, people that live well, people that live excellently, that live up to Roman virtues, that are courageous, wise, temperate, just, they tend to have more pleasure. It's almost like a heuristic. They tend to live better lives than those that are cowardly, intemperate, unjust, not wise. And so we actually like we lose track of the original art,
Yeah,
the
original observation.
grounding.
Yeah.
Yeah, the original observation. Yeah, so we want pleasure. Virtue gets pleasure, but then it becomes the measure that fails to achieve the target. We start actually pursuing virtue and forgetting that we just did that in the first place to get at pleasure, which is a compelling way of putting it, I think.
Yeah, people start talking about courage, moderation, justice, wisdom, and they forget that those are virtues only insofar as they, for the Epicurean, produce pleasure. And I think the argument Torquatus is making is that virtue must be productive of something. Like there's nothing valuable in and of itself of doing something courageous. It's even hard to describe what that would be if courage doesn't refer to some other values. And that's that example of, we praise the physician not just for some empty skill, but because he successfully brings about health in other people, and that's his end. So then we
Mm-hmm.
need to define what is virtue pointing at? What's this activity of virtue? And Visco and for the Epicureans, of course, is like, well, we are given that when he came into the world, it's pleasure. What is courage? He says, and there is this nice section where he goes through the cardinal virtues. Courage, it's not just the suffering of pain in itself that's attractive, nor yet endurance, nor diligence, nor watchings, nor much praise industry itself, no, nor courage either. But we devote ourselves to all such things for the purpose of passing our life in freedom from anxiety and alarm, and of emancipating both mind and body so far as we can succeed in doing so from annoyance. Why is it awesome to be courageous? Because then you're no longer scared, that is experiencing pain, when you need to do something important, because you're able to make decisions that bring about a happier life for yourself, for your friends, and such, because you are not anxious in sort of those critical moments. And I think that's an essential. I think that's a nice move for the Epicurean to make, and one they need to make here, of course.
Yeah, it's a good move. I mean, to be charitable. So if I was like taking my criticism of Stoicism hat, taking that off the shelf and putting that on, um, the Stoics kind of have to make a play here. They have to make a jump because the non-philosophical person, what does Stoicism offer you? It says, well, hey, the dichotomy of control, you're anxious about things that aren't up to you. Oh, hey, the view from above, you're getting stressed because you've lost perspective. Oh, you're getting angry all the time. You're feeling these passions you don't want to experience that are disruptive, they're unpleasant. Hey, we offer these tools that can take them away. The Stoic is almost selling you the cardinal virtues. At least I would say maybe the Stoic isn't doing this on purpose, but the way they have to present them to even get anybody to latch on to Stoicism as a philosophy, you're almost selling this pleasure argument, right? Or at least a reduction of pain argument. If you study Stoicism, you'll suffer less. You'll have less extreme emotions, like bad, negative emotions, less anxiety. You'll feel more confident. You'll feel less stressed. the Stoics are selling this argument, and then the Epicurean is going to be like, and then some way along the way, you kind of like switch the goal, right? You're like, you offer pleasure as this target, and then you're like, no, it's actually living in accordance with nature. And somebody goes, well, screw that. I don't want to live in accordance with nature. I want to be happy. And then the Stoics go, well, no. Living in accordance with nature will also make you happy. It just happens to also bring along this pleasant side effect. And then people are like, oh, okay, I guess I'll keep learning about it. But there's this almost this bait and switch that the Stoics have to kind of justify that I guess the Epicureans don't have to. And I always think that's interesting. And you see that a lot in people that are beginning to study Stoicism. They're coming to it for the pleasure component, right? Or the removal of pain.
Yeah, I think so. I think arguably a large. I think that's a classic criticism of Stoicism. I think that you almost have the same criticism of Epicureanism, where you start with pleasure, but then you learn that what it is to have the most pleasurable life is to be virtuous, to exercise these classic virtues and such. And perhaps the Cyrenaics, the other hedonists, are a little bit more consistent on that front, or at least more realistic in the sense that they didn't think there was such a nice mapping on to classic virtues and living a pleasurable life.
Yeah. Another way to kind of test this is the Stoics have this famous framing of, the Stoic can be happy on the torture rack. And then it's like, it really, I think, tests the way you think about Stoic happiness, because, what do you think the Stoic is saying there? Is the Stoic saying that the person on the torture rack has such a degree of mental fortitude that they're serene? Or is the argument that person is suffering like hell, but you can respect them because, they're not giving up, they're not, betraying their country or divulging a secret, or they'd rather die before they do something like that. And the Stoic argument is something on the later half, which is like they're suffering terribly, but you can still admire them. Where the Epicurean can't admire that person. That's not a good life if they're suffering terribly.
Yeah. And I think they'll also make the move, at that moment, if you're suffering terribly, say, in order for some other greater cause, withstanding torture, not divulging secrets and such, they also need to make that move that you're not doing that because divulging those secrets would bring about so much shame.
would be more painful than
Well, exactly. Torquatus takes on that example of his ancestor who punished had his own son executed, and he says the following: "Yes, with the whole army looking on, what did he gain by it? Applause and affection, which are the strongest guarantees for passing life in freedom from fear. He punished his son with death, if purposelessly. I should be sorry to be descended from one so abominable and so cruel. But if he did it to enforce virtue by a self-inflicted pain, the law of military command, and by fear of punishment to control the army in midst of a most critical war, then he had in view the preservation of his fellow countrymen, which he knew to involve his own. And these principles have a wide application." So, yeah, I think that's just I think you can say that there is something to that reply, which, beliefs about fear of punishment, pragmatic beliefs about what's necessary, in this case for military command, perhaps what's necessary to preserve, to achieve one's goals, those do play a role, and those are connected to pleasure in some way. But I don't know, how convincing do you find that?
I mean, my initial impression was that's whack, was what I said in my head. I find it, I don't find it convincing. Again, it comes back to the thing we said before. Yes, he's making a cost to benefit analysis. Like, you're not wrong, but he's not making a pleasure cost benefit analysis. That's it, right? Like, even the utilitarian has room to say, well, I value pleasure, but I'm going to value the pleasure of this entire army who will lose morale and get slaughtered. But the Epicurean can only value their own pleasure, right? Like, they're only looking internally. And so the utilitarian has an argument there, but the Epicurean does not.
Yeah. Then, so that's like, I mean, this is a case of someone sacrificing their son, but of course, the Epicureans also have issues with self-sacrifice generally. You think, and some of these other great stories we have about people sacrificing their lives for the sake of loved ones. Why do they do that? Because they value the loved ones, because they see the loved one's pleasure as their own, but it's not literally their own pleasure, right? So that can't be it. Is it the fact that if they didn't do that act, that would be worse than death? They'd have to live with that kind of knowledge. Um, it really seems like a bit of a stretch to say that's it.
Well, and the Epicurean has to say something stronger, right? Because we're talking this descriptive level.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like the Epicureans, they don't deny that, yes, that person is doing it because they're trying to be virtuous, right? Like the Epicurean can point to their grandfather and say, yeah, he did that because he was trying to be virtuous. But the Epicurean just has to say, but that was stupid, right? Like that's not really the good way to make a decision. And so in your example of like, well, I sacrificed myself to let my family member live because I would find the pain of surviving worse than death or something like this. Not only the Epicureans have to say, they don't have to say that's how the reasoning goes, but they have to say that that's the right way to think about it, and that any other way of thinking about it is missing the point of life. Right? Like if you sacrifice yourself because you love the other person and want something good for them, that cost benefit analysis is just the wrong one. You should be like conceptualizing your pleasure, which is really weird to me.
Yeah, that's this. So there's a nice statement of the Epicurean principle of selection here, which is just this idea that the wise man should, or maybe I'll start over. So it's just this stated here. So in such cases, the principle of selection adopted by the wise man is that he should either, by refusing certain pleasures, attain to other and greater pleasures, or by enduring pains, should ward off pains still more severe. So that it's a useful principle, and I think a crucial one for understanding Epicureanism. It solves a lot of misunderstandings of the philosophy. This idea that you should just jump into experiencing the most intense pleasures you can with no thought of tomorrow. You can use this principle of selection to say, you should avoid risky pleasures, you should avoid addictive pleasures, and you should undergo great suffering when doing so will bring about more happiness. But as you say, I think if we think about so many admirable people in history, admirable acts, people who we think we want to emulate, it doesn't seem like this is a thought process they're going through when they make those decisions that set them apart. So I think that's we're jumping perhaps a little bit too much on the criticism side, but I think that is that is certainly an issue.
I mean, yeah, we're a biased podcast for sure. But the other thing that the Stoics have going for themselves is they just have is that the Stoics also adopt this descriptive position. And they're like, well, kids also begin like looking at self-preservation, which, I can't remember exactly the way it's worded now, but, wouldn't seem to me to be strange to view self-preservation as the pursuit of pleasure and the avoidance of pain, right? But the Stoics just think, you grow up and when you hit a certain age, you start to value things that aren't pleasure. You start to value things that aren't just your personal self-preservation. In other words, you just add things to your cost-benefit scale. You're just allowed to incorporate other ways of thinking about the world. I mean, again, for them, I should say the Stoics then again reduce it to a single thing, which is just virtue or vice, or like, acting appropriately or inappropriately. So they are like reductionist or simplistic as well in that sense. But the descriptive argument, maybe it doesn't have that strong of an argument if you're like, yeah, that's what kids do. That doesn't mean that's how I should act as an adult, but like, yeah, you're right. That's what kids do.
Yeah, that's right. Something that I do like about the Epicureans, a number of other, I think you can probably read other schools of ancient philosophy this way, is they sort of blow up the descriptive and normative distinction. I know I introduced that initially, and we've been using that throughout. But the way Torquatus argues is he says, just start with observation, start with human nature, what we're pointed towards, and then that's just going to give you these descriptive facts about human nature is going to give you the picture of the good life, and you don't need to, or perhaps some of these modern moves where someone says, "Oh, you can describe human nature, but it's possible that human nature is flawed, and that's not what we end up pointing towards is not in fact the good life naturally." I think that's that kind of thinking is somewhat alien, perhaps, to this argument for Epicureanism.
Yeah, it's a good point, but I guess it's just there's just this. I
You
guess even on its own terms, the Epicureans then have to like explain the descriptive reality that people are pulled towards virtue, and
sure,
they have
yeah,
to kind of they've got confused now. That's not really nature. That's like them getting confused. And again, I mean, the Stoics do the same thing, right? They have to make the same argument about pleasure, where they say, well, people are they've corrupted or confused. So it's the same play the Stoics make, but you kind of end up, when you compress those two together, you end up doing the same thing. You're just arguing about what the real descriptive truth is, I guess.
sure. Maybe you can also push another line of criticism that look, the Stoics, they don't make that so much hay about that distinction. Aristotelians don't, but that's because they think nature is ordered. From the Stoics' case, it has its providential aspects. So it has normativity, it has purpose, has telos built into it. Whereas Epicureans, they're a little bit more on the deist side. They believe in the gods, but they don't think the gods care that much about us. So there's maybe a little also that question mark. If you just have that descriptive reality, is this really a benefit of philosophy that you think the descriptive and normative are
Mm-hmm.
tied so closely together when it could very well just be a coincidence?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good point.
Well, to end on a positive note, I like this description of friendship from the Epicureans. So there's some nice lines. Truly, we both rejoice at the joy of our friends as much as at our own joy, and are equally pained by their vexations. Therefore, the wise man will entertain the same feeling for his friend as for himself, and the very same efforts which he would undergo to procure his own pleasure, these he will undergo to procure that of his friend. It's nicely stated, and I think Epicureans' friendship was very important about them. Essentially, they thought, all you need for the good life is to retreat into the garden with a community of people who you love, enough food to survive, and some basic pleasures, and that's it. And I think what's really doing the work for them in that vision is that community. But I think that's something that Epicurus is right to emphasize. So, because other philosophies, of course, will emphasize that aspect as well. Humans are social creatures, but the Epicureans do a good job of it, and I think also it's not as perhaps moralistic. I think part of friendship just really is the pleasurable aspect of it, and just having fun with other humans is a great thing to do. So nicely stated.
Yeah, I like that way you just put it. Not moralistic. It's like, yeah, friends are good because they're really fun. It's really nice to have friends. You're like, okay, yeah, seems like that's a reasonable argument. Yeah. Where the Stoics have to like the Stoics have to make some weird argument that like friendship is desirable for its own sake. If they're a sage, like contemplating the good character of another person, and you're like, that's kind of a weird way to talk about friendship. I like my friends because I like being around them. That's a bit more compelling. Um, the other one I wanted to say is I think that like again being positive because we did our we threw in our Stoic jabs there. I think the Epicureans, I really like the way that they divide kind of like needs. Is that the language that they use? There's this idea of, look, there's things that are like necessary. There are things that aren't necessary. And um, there was kind of this division of like, if something's necessary, it's pretty easy to acquire. If something's not necessary, it can be difficult to acquire, but you can survive fine without it.
Mm-hmm.
And so the kind of necessary things like, water, enough food to survive, shelter, these things are actually pretty easy to get. And so it's this kind of view of like, yeah, you should take your basic human needs pretty seriously, but it's not that difficult to get them. And I almost think that does a better, or it does this like better job, I think, actually from like a practical day-to-day moment of dealing with the kind of anxiety around possessions and externals than the Stoic view of like preferred indifference, indifference, and dispreferred indifference does. Because I find the preferred indifference thing, it's like, yeah, you should want, like, it's fine to want money, but like, you shouldn't be upset if you lose your job. And it kind of, it doesn't, it's a helpful reminder about giving you permission to pursue some things, but it's not very behavior guiding because it comes down a lot of the times to your roles. It comes down, maybe you should be selecting that dispreferred indifferent in a specific context. It's very complicated.
Mm-hmm.
The Stoicism does not have a lot of precise things to say about navigating the world of externals. It more says like practice Stoicism and then make the right call, which is good advice. But I just like the way the Epicureans are like, well, is that something you need? Like, oh, I can't afford this lobster dinner. Well, do you need a lobster dinner? No. Okay. Well, like do you have enough food to eat? Yes. Okay. Well, it's fine. Do you have enough food to eat? No. Okay. Well, that is a problem, and that probably should stress you out. But like, and then maybe like, take some serious steps to resolve that and get enough food for yourself or your family. But, for me, it's a more helpful way of thinking about these things. Like, is that necessary or unnecessary? Where I think maybe the indifference lumps a lot of stuff together. What do you think?
Yeah. Well, I wouldn't say indifference lumps a lot of stuff together, but just that it is complex because there are so many different preferred
Mhm.
indifference. And as you say, depends on the circumstances, your roles. So I think a useful way to think about Epicureans from a Stoic perspective is when they're right, where they're most useful, is thinking about from the Stoic perspective, pleasure is a preferred indifferent, and the Epicureans have
Hmm.
a lot of good thoughts about how to relate to it properly and how to achieve that preferred indifferent and how, when to select it and perhaps when not to select it. So, and I think they also, and perhaps maybe this is just comes with the territory. Our decisions are complex. They involve all kinds of social facts, values, and of course pleasure. But the pleasure is involved with a lot of these decisions we make, the cardinal virtues, even if they're not completely tied up with pleasure, if they're not completely productive of pleasure, pleasure does matter. So I think that's not something we should overlook. And insofar as the Epicureans thought about that and thought about some of the strategies for achieving a pleasurable life, then they're quite useful. And I think you have that heuristic of, do I need it? Is it easy to obtain? In addition to, of course, just the principle of selection, which can be useful. I think Stoics can put that to use.
Well, I love that. I've never thought of it that way, but it's kind of like, go to a specialist when you want to learn about something. And the Epicureans are the pleasure specialists, not in like a hedonistic way, but in really like maximizing that preferred indifferent over a lifetime. They'll tell you how to do it. Now, that's not the goal of life, according to the Stoics, but it's a part of life, and the Epicureans are a great place to learn how to do it well. So that's a really cool way of framing it.
Cool. Nice. Yeah. So I'll just end with the summary of Epicurus. From Cicero, this is the way in which Epicurus represents the wise man as continually happy. He keeps his passions within bounds. About death he is indifferent. He holds true views concerning the eternal gods apart from all dread. He has no hesitation in crossing the boundary of life, if that be the better course. And
Sounds nice.
yeah, sounds excellent. Sounds not a bad way to be. And we'll take on the next book in future episodes. Awesome. Thanks, Michael.
Thanks, Caleb.
Thanks for listening to Stoa Conversations. Please give us a rating on Apple Podcasts or Spotify and share it with a friend. If you want to dive deeper still, search Stoa in the App Store or Play Store for a complete app with routines, meditations, and lessons designed to help people become more stoic. And I'd also like to thank Michael Levy for graciously letting us use his music. You can find more of his work at ancientlyre.com. And finally, please get in touch with us. Send a message to stoa@stoameditation.com if you ever have any feedback, questions, or recommendations. Until next time.